Hello, my name's Andy Christopher Miller, and this is my book, The Naples of England. It's a memoir. It's about growing up in an English seaside resort, Weymouth in Dorset, in the years after the Second World War, and I've written it as a sequence of vignettes. I've been very pleased, and I would have to say surprised, at the reception and the sales for a self-published memoir that this has attracted. I've been asked to speak to a range of community groups over the years, and was particularly delighted to be asked to talk to the Friends of Weymouth Library a few years ago, where on a Saturday morning 50 or more people turned out to hear me read from it and talk about it. The chapters cover my growing up years from 1946 through to 1964, and there are two at the end which jump forward in time to the 1980s. But it opens with a chapter called Safe of Houses. Let me just read you the first paragraph. "It was them ruddy Japs," my mother said. Johnny Forrest's dad was slap bang in the middle of the road outside our house. "They were cruel devils. They tortured their prisoners," she added. "He was a nice fella," Johnny Forrest's dad, my mum said, but now he was red-faced and raging at the top of his voice. Normally, he was softly spoken and polite. Today, it was forbidden swear words and little else. "That's how it left poor devils like him." There was nobody there as the obvious recipient of his anger, and our neighbours were all indoors, avoiding their windows. "Come away. Somebody will fetch him." There were those occasional reminders that the world wasn't a safe place, but by and large, growing up straight after the Second World War, I don't think I was alone in this, I had this strong sense that we were a generation that was cared for, protected, and people had a great investment in our well-being and our growing up. I wrote this about being at infant school and listening to radio broadcasts in the assembly hall, for broadcasts for children. Mounted up towards the ceiling, large varnished speakers with circular golden grills beamed down reassuring voices into the hall. "Hello, children. Do you remember the song we've been learning about a sixpence? When the music stops, Uncle Brian will be here to teach you the next verse." Each note from the piano reverberated around the room, haunting harmonics high in the hall. Occasionally, children slumped to the floor to be scooped into a more comfortable position by patrolling teachers, even covered with small blankets in winter, while the rest of us were entranced further by the respectable, measured diction coming from the speakers. Our teachers and these kindly broadcasters in an easy partnership, furthering our nurture. We would not go hungry. We will be comforted. We were to be protected from preventable disease. We were to aspire. We were to have knowledge, and then to know even more, right out to the very boundaries, if we wished. Each of the short chapters is a vignette, and it covers a range of subjects about growing up on the estate where I lived, and in the fields, and then as I got a bit older down towards the beach and the seaside resort. Here's an early piece about calling in on my grandfather, who had been a sailor. "You've come at the right time," he said. On the table was a large whisky bottle on its side, and inside a mess of wood, fabric, twine. "Watch this," he said, steadying his breathing to control against any cloud of smoke from his cigarette that might obscure his eye line. Carefully, the tiny muscles around his mouth regulating his efforts, he drew towards him the threads hanging from the bottle's neck and the muddle of its contents began to assert itself into the full blossoming of a rigged ship in sail. Decks, masts, canvas against the wind, ropes taking the tension. He let out a small breath, a pinched but deep satisfaction. There was nothing here that words could improve upon, although they tumbled out from me indiscriminately. He said nothing in reply, either absorbing or deflecting my gabble, but smiled and nodded at the bottle in front of him on the table. In this dull back room, with treacle-like varnish on the panelled wall that held in the stairs, I had seen the birth of a morning at sea, fuelled with enough confidence for a full circumnavigation, able to hold a determined course beneath the most perverse or alien of constellations. And then there's other chapters about dodgy blokes who we learn to avoid, with awful tales of what might befall us if we fell into their hands. Learning life's lessons in the fields around the estate and on the streets, knowing all of the birds' nests in the area and recognising all the eggs, and the cruelty of some of the older kids with air rifles shooting at birds on rooftops. The elderly neighbour next door who died from a bee sting or a heart attack triggered by a bee sting, and then how I used to go and play cards with his widow in the house next door, in this deep, solemn furniture that old people seem to have then. And then there's a chapter about halfway through which is called The Naples of England, and that's I wanted to write about a seaside resort and the real excitement of how a seaside resort opens up in the very early days of summer. I still think it's exciting 50 years or more later. So shutters and awnings rattling, dust beaten out, accumulated pockets of sand swept from doorways, council vehicles parked up on the empty pedestrians-only promenade, the clatter from lorry loads of deck chairs out of winter storage and being built into stacks on the beach, canoes nestling like sardines, huge floating craft across the backs of youths, their arms splayed as if in crucifixion, carried down to the water's edge, narrow strutted jetties wheeled into the sea, prodding the retreating nip of winter, still residing in the sea's temperature. In the clear, exacting focus of a new season's light, beach stalls creaking open, crockery clinking, and cups chattering in wire trays, urns subjected to trial runs with bulky masses of steaming water, serving hatches prizing open, chalkboards brought out into the daylight, rows of hooks weighted down with joyous trivia. From rooftops, balconies, and empty stale interiors, the broken orchestration of hammer and saw, fresh resin, and the heady musk of tar and paint, all in preparation for the silver shoals, the flocks alighting, the herds stopping to graze, survival and restoration, appetite and livelihood. My father will be out shopping in the town centre on summer Saturday mornings as early as he could. "If you're not done at home by 10, you might as well forget it," he would say. So the later parts of the book cover my graduation from the children's library into the adult library, and all the wonderful array of books that I used to scan. I didn't used to read them, I used to just walk through them and read the titles, and I seem to be quite good at remembering the titles, so I did give off the air of being very, very well read, although I'd only read the spines of books. It talks about my grammar school years, where I found a lot of the teachers drab and uninspiring, and I didn't really do very well there. But we did have one really quite bohemian teacher who ran a kind of walking and nature study club, and when I was about 15 or so, we went to a party at her house. My parents were beside themselves, the idea of a party, and they were instructing me about manners and all the rest of it. But I knew it wasn't that sort of party, and it was a real eye-opener for me. I'll just read a little bit about what I said. Irene's cottage was a battered, pink-washed, double-fronted building. I was welcomed into her softly lit living room, where a type of music I'd never heard before, a lazy saxophone wandering around a brushed snare drum, was playing. Her chairs were much smaller than ours, and made of unvarnished wood, and there was no linoleum on the floor, just mats on top of bare stone. There were paintings on the walls, real ones, nudes even, and melancholy figures, some of whom I vaguely recognised. The older pupils stood in the centre of the room, talking loudly and sipping drinks. A few of the boys were wearing cravats beneath open-necked shirts, and some of the girls, in what seemed like an absurd attempt to mimic grown women, were wearing nylons and smeared makeup. Irene offered me a glass of brown ale, only my second ever alcoholic drink. I struggled to understand the conversation of the older pupils and certainly could offer no contribution. Feeling tense and alert, swimming in the malty tang of my drink, the rows of books provided a secure fix for my attention. In our living room at home, we had a Bible, an old encyclopedia, a digested compendium of Dickens, and I curated my own slim collection of Enid Blyton, Just William, and Biggles books. On Irene's shelves, however, were rows and rows of books with green or orange spines, paperbacks, their titles provocative and sophisticated. I scanned them with my head tilted to one side as the effects of the brown ale pulled me further over and down towards the floor. The L-shaped room. Vile bodies. The heart is a lonely hunter. I then went on to talk about summer jobs that I'd had. One was working in a bingo stall where the guy who owned the stall in an arcade, he had been a lion tamer and done all sorts of things. And one day his wife got him to show me his back, and across it were these great scars where once he'd been mauled by a lion. It was very, very exciting. Also at that time, it was the Profumo affair in the news, Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis, and it was a time of my own sexual awakening with all this going on. And every day when I collected the money from the old ladies who came, mainly old ladies who came in to play bingo in the arcade, there was dark mutterings. They were very, very animated and excited about the latest developments in the trial of Stephen Ward. And I was bemused and half understood it and half didn't, but it was kind of all part of my education. There's stuff about trying to form a pop group with my friends and having to realise that I was completely unmusical, unable to sing in tune or play any instrument, and they had to get rid of me, and I had to accept that I wasn't going to be part of that exciting future. Instead, I wanted some kind of bohemian life of wandering and reading and writing and mixing with creative, inspiring characters. But also I was hedging my bets and under all the pressure to apply for further education in some form. So I've talked about my naivety really, but also the fact that in those times it seemed okay to be naive. So I've tried to capture all those sort of feelings really in that period from 1946 to the mid-1960s. There's rock climbing. I was introduced to rock climbing, and that stayed a lifelong interest and passion of mine, turning into mountaineering and in some of the big mountain ranges of the world. But that all began on the Dorset sea cliff. So I've referred to all these things and tried to make an interesting range of perspectives. The last two chapters are different, as I said, and I won't talk about them. They take place in the 1980s, and all I will say is that they lead to a re-examination of all this upbringing and this life, and to ask whether it really was quite as idyllic and exciting as I remembered it. Although it wasn't my specific intention, I realised that after I had written the book, and when I started getting feedback from some readers, that I'd been involved in writing a sort of love letter to a particular time and a particular place. But the reviews cheered me up because, for instance, on Amazon, an ex-colleague of mine called Claire wrote that this book reminded her so much of her own upbringing, but she was a generation younger than me and female and had grown up in a northern city, so I realised that I'd perhaps touched something that was a bit more than just a kind of parochial book, and I was delighted by that. Tony Jones, who was the 2016 winner of the Writers Guild of Great Britain Award for Best Radio Drama, he also wrote a review, and he called it the book excellent and said it's much more than regional nostalgia. The writing can shift from lovingly recorded detail to moments of powerful experience, and everything is jolted into another perspective by the last two sections, giving the whole piece a new significance and weight. And I suppose my favourite review came from John Lindley, who has been Poet Laureate for Cheshire and also Manchester Cathedral poet. And he wrote that this was a wonderful book and that anyone yet to read it has a real treat in store. So I've been delighted by all the reviews and feedback, and thank you very much if you're watching this. The book is available on Amazon, both as a paperback and as an ebook. Thank you very much.